All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. My guest today is Dr. Gerard Casey. Dr. Casey is Professor Emeritus at University College Dublin and Associate Scholar of the Mises Institute. He has written several books and articles, including Let the Poor Starve, A Libertarian Approach to Welfare, which challenges the popular notion that government welfare programs help the needy and argues that libertarian principles can create systems that better help the poor. We will be discussing this paper on the show today. Dr. Casey, welcome to the Protestant Libertarian Podcast.
Thank you very much, Alex. I'm glad to be here.
Well, I'm very excited to have you here. I've listened to you on several podcasts that I enjoy, and you are a really smart guy. We follow each other on Twitter. And a couple of, I guess about a year ago, maybe about a year and a half ago, you sent me a paper that you had delivered about welfare and charity and things like that. And so I thought it was excellent, and I'm really excited to talk to you about it today. But before we get into all of that, just to tell my audience a little bit about yourself, background, and your work.
Well, as your listeners and viewers can probably tell from listening to me, I'm not American. I'm Irish, although I did spend 8 very happy years in the United States, 5 of them at the University of Notre Dame, where I was a graduate student, and 3 at the Catholic University of America in Washington, where I was on the academic staff. But before that, I grew up in the second city in Ireland, Cork, and did my undergraduate degree in Cork, and then I went to the University of Notre Dame, and so given the nature of your podcast, I grew up, as it were, in a Catholic environment, but it was never very firm, and I had what I suspect is a pretty common experience in my mid-teens of losing my faith spectacularly, not least because I discovered philosophy. And philosophy is like water; it's the universal solvent. And so, filled with the normal modesty of a teenager of that years, I thought I was incredibly smart myself, and everybody else was exceedingly stupid. Not least religious people who believed all this incredible nonsense, and so I jettisoned all of that, and things continued in that vein for quite a while. These weren't, as Newman would later say, these weren't real questions anymore. They were notional questions. None of these things, whether there was a God or not, and if there was, what difference it made to anything, wasn't actually a real question for me. And but when I arrived at the University of Notre Dame, it became a real question, but in circumstances that your listeners probably wouldn't experience, because first of all, I was no longer the smartest guy in the class. There were a lot of smart people there, not only on the staff, but among my fellow students. And here was the really puzzling thing, which was that most of my fellow graduate students were Christians and Protestant and serious. And this was a real existential shock to me, because I thought religious believers were stupid, but these people were manifestly not stupid. And so, it started me thinking about these things again, not yet in any real sense, more as a kind of, I suppose, a kind of conceptual game. If they wanted to argue about things like if infant baptism was efficacious, I was quite happy to pitch in. So there were all sorts of people there, Dutch Reformed and Wesleyan Methodist and Baptists, and oh my gosh, people I'd never even heard of before, and a strange and mystifying variety of people. But they all knew a whole lot more than I did, especially about Christianity. And so they tended to sort of gang up on me and say, well, at least we're not like those crazy Catholics, and we believe, who think you kind of pull up to a kind of, spiritual filling station on a Sunday and kind of tank up. Sometimes it was as crude as that. And it was fairly robust. It was kind of fun. But I thought, in the interest of self-defense, I had better learn something, even though I wasn't a Catholic and therefore wasn't defending my faith, but rather defending a faith that wasn't mine, but purely in the interest of not seeing, as it were, Catholicism hanged for crimes that she hadn't actually committed.
Right.
So after about, 2 or 3 years of this, I got to know a lot about Christianity in general, and about specific positions and things I would never have encountered otherwise. And that was great. And then I was very good friends with many people. One particular good friend and I, the two of us and our wives went out, I can't remember where, probably to the cinema, and came back to my house to have some tea and biscuits, and then our wives got fed up with us because we told all day and all night. That's like, I'm sure. And they went off and left the two of us there. And then, things kind of went quiet after a while. And then he said to me, "Why aren't you a Christian?" Now, see, nobody had asked me that. And I kind of answered it with, my reasons of 13 or whatever it was years ago. But I had sort of funny experience of it being as if someone else was talking, not me. But I don't know if you've ever had a situation when you've had, in the old days, when you had to buy sat-nav and couldn't use Google Maps.
Oh, yeah.
If you didn't get the update and somebody put in a new road, when you drove in it, the sat-nav told you were in the middle of a field. You kind of go, "Oh, what's happening here?" Well, that's what I felt like. I felt as if I was kind of in the middle of a spiritual field. I didn't know where I was. I didn't quite know what I believed. I didn't know what I didn't believe. And then I had to start. So that turned it into a real question for me. And being the kind of person I am, where I read books, I read furiously everything I get my hands on for months and months and months. Well, you see, it's like when you develop an appetite, for food. So I can't believe the amount of stuff I read in about 6 months. And then I had a sort of strange experience when I was coming back from the philosophy school one day, walking behind the big church in Notre Dame. Was a big, I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's sort of French Gothic. It's very fancy inside and so on. And my way home went around the back and by the lake and so on. And but in the basement of this incredibly fantastic French kind of style Gothic church is a humdrum chapel with linoleum on the floor and just plain wooden seats and nothing fancy, no stained glass windows, nothing. And I felt this incredible impulse to go in. And I often describe it as if somebody was putting, if you come to a door and you hold it open and you kind of put your hand behind the person's back, you don't shove them through the door, okay? But you kind of guide them through the door just to let them know and so on. So it was that kind of, I couldn't even say it was a physical pressure, but I felt this urge to go in, and I don't know why. It was the middle of the day and it wasn't Easter it wasn't Advent and it wasn't Lent, so any particular time. And I found myself in this church in the middle of the day. And there was actually a confessional in operation, which is, I think, a minor miracle. Okay.
Yeah.
And while I'd been thinking about that, and I was kind of had this internal conversation going, "You're not ready." And the other part of me said, "Well, you'll never be ready." It's kind of Gollum-like conversation, right? So, okay. I would say, "Well, you're not prepared." And I go, "Well, yes, but if I wait to be prepared, then the moment will have passed and who knows what will happen." And then, I remember the Spirit lists where it will. And so I went in and the slide went back and I made a confession and the best I could. Not the best way to do it, by the way. We put that on record, but nonetheless, you do what you have to do at the time. And then there was a silence for what seemed like an eternity. And then the priest said to me, "I'm very glad to be here today to receive your confession." And I was absolutely shocked. Okay, I expected that, he was going to order the firing squad. And so, but he didn't. And that was the beginning. And that's where I've been, and I'm kind of working my way back. I feel I don't know if you know that passage in Lewis where he's talked about, taking the bus to Whipsnade Zoo and suddenly kind of discovering that he was a Christian and wasn't really happy about it. I have to say, I'm not particularly happy about it. I wasn't at the time and I'm not now. Okay. In some ways, I'd much prefer if I weren't. Okay. Either a Christian or a Catholic. And so to make life so much easier. But there's sort of nothing I can do about it. It's just one of these things. Anyway, that's the short story. Then I just to finish that up, we don't want to go on forever. I graduated and I applied for and was given a post at Catholic University. I was there on a tenure track for a couple of two terms, and then a position came up in University College Dublin. I applied, and to my surprise and to some extent annoyance, because I was very happy in Washington. Okay. I was offered the job, but my wife was anxious to come home, and we had 3 children at that stage. So yeah, and that was it. And I was at University College Dublin then for 30 years. I became this is really the end of the story. So politically, I suppose you would have described me as kind of nondescript, mild kind of liberal, not card carrying, not enthusiastic, not particularly interested in politics. And I actually got involved in politics in with a Christian party in the 90s because I thought that, in a sense, that Christianity was being eclipsed in a certain way, and that politics was the way to do it. That was wrong, but it took 6 years of my life, a lot of effort, with a lot of help from people, which I very much appreciated. But that had to come to an end because it was simply taking up all my time, and I was neglecting my family, and it wasn't good. But then in the 2000s, a friend of mine in the department went to Germany on a sabbatical, and he brought, because I was he'd come in and we'd have discussions about what money is. I was always puzzled about money, not just that I never seemed to have enough of it, but that I didn't know what it was. It was a sort of strange thing, and he brought me back a book called A Theory of Money and Credit. And I don't know if anybody has read, besides me, has read
Yeah.
The Theory of Money and Credit, but it's not an easy book. Okay, it's not a book I would recommend to anybody to start with. Okay, but like as I said before, this was a question that was real for me, and this was the answer. And again, within a year, I think I'd read practically everything that Mises had written: bureaucracy, the human action, all of the stuff. And then, of course, once you discover Mises, you discover Rothbard, and once you discover Rothbard, you discover the Mises Institute. And then I was listening to all the recordings, and eventually I got to the stage where I suggested a paper to the Austrian Scholars Conference in Auburn in 2007, and I arrived and gave it. I remember Tom Wood said to me afterwards, we looked at one another and said, who is this guy? where, where, where had I come from out of nowhere? And that's pretty much it from there on. I mean, I worked on the reason I wrote the book Libertarian Anarchy was because I got tired of answering questions, and I thought I'd write a book. People can read the book. Unfortunately, all that happens is they ask me questions about the book.
Right.
Anyway, so Alex, we'll stop at that. That's pretty much it, really. So.
Yeah, no, that was a perfect summary, and it dovetails perfectly with what I want to talk to you about today. So you delivered a paper a few years ago entitled "Let the Poor Starve: A Libertarian Approach to Welfare," which is a hilarious title for it. What interested you in the topic of welfare and charity?
To be honest, I wasn't particularly interested in that topic to start with. Um, and for me, I mean, as a libertarian, you'll know this, that the great libertarian divide is between minarchists and anarchists, between those who think that everything that we need can be supplied by free association and voluntary action, except law, justice, and security. And those are minarchists, right? And then people like myself who are anarchists who think you can go all the way. Minarchism, of course, is a much easier sell in that sense because people and so on. But I think it's incoherent. But that's neither here nor there. That's not an argument we're going to have tonight and so on. So for me, the kind of critical, if you were interested in this, the critical question was: can law, justice, and security be provided by private means and voluntary association? But then I discovered when I talked to people who weren't libertarians that, in fact, their worry or their concern was that if you were a libertarian, inevitably that the poor would suffer. People would be left without any safety net, and that libertarians were, even if they tried to deny it, absolutely careless about poor people and the fact that they would starve or die in the gutter or lack medical care and all of these things, and we were horrible people. So I had to think about it, and I thought, well, why not go with a title which actually addresses the concern, even if they were too polite to say it: let the poor starve, and try to address that question and show the fact that libertarian not only doesn't have that implication, but that all things considered, it is actually a better option than what we have available in any of our political systems right now.
Yeah, and you start with the basic libertarian principle of non-aggression, and I want you to explain that too. But before the show today, on in the DMs on Twitter, we were kind of talking back and forth about these ideas of self-ownership and how a lot of these very basic libertarian concepts are indebted to deeply held Christian beliefs. And so maybe talk about like those first principles, the things that we have to understand in order to have this conversation set on a firm foundation, and how that might relate to our Christian faith.
Well, one thing I should probably get out of the way at the start is that I found that typically my fellow Christians or Catholics tend to believe that I can't be a Catholic and a libertarian. And my libertarian friends tend to believe that I can't be a libertarian and a Catholic. Okay. And I say, watch me. Right. But so here's the problem. But to take it seriously, there is a problem here in the sense that when you talk about self-ownership, an educated a Christian will say, but hang on a second, we are God's creatures. He has, as it were, made us. In that sense, we don't own ourselves. And in fact, if you take soteriology seriously, he's died for us, as it were. And in doing that, he has, as it were, redeemed us. And when you redeem something, you've taken it out of the ownership of somebody else into your own ownership. And therefore, in a sense, God owns us. So you cannot, with good conscience, say you own yourself. And that is a good point. But of course, we're not talking here on the theological level. We're not, when we assert self-ownership as a libertarian and a Christian, you're not asserting that against the claim that God or Jesus has on you. Okay, you can fully accept that. You're talking about it in the horizontal context in relation to other human beings. Minimally, you're saying no one else, that is to say, no other human being or group of human beings owns me. Okay, and with that, you're also asserting something I think that is very basic if you're a Christian, which is that one of the things that we have been endowed with, now this is again is a contentious issue depending on which branch of Christianity you subscribe to, but for me, and I'd say for many Christians, unless you're a sort of a hardcore Calvinist, we have free will. That is to say, we have been given a gift that mirrors our origin as it were, creatures made by God as rational beings with the ability to choose. Now, there are all sorts of influences. I fully understand that. I mean, we live in the world and we're influenced in various ways. But in the end, at root, we must accept responsibility for our choices. Otherwise, we are not creatures made in the image and likeness of God. We are simply automata. And if you want to think that, well, go ahead. But that's not something I think I can believe as a Christian. So when you take all of that together, then when you start thinking about libertarianism in that context, it seems to me that not only is it not incompatible with one's Christianity, it's in fact perfectly compatible. Okay, because as my argument has been that if God, who if anyone has the right to compel us, because he owns us in the ultimate sense, to do what he wants, if he's not willing to do that, I don't see where anybody else gets off doing it. It doesn't make any sense. And I was delighted to find when I did research for my book, Freedom's Progress, that some of the thinkers during the English Revolution, especially among the Levellers and so on, Winstanley and Overton, thought the same thing. And they brought together, if you like, elements from Scripture and the Christian tradition on freedom and the political thinking which was emerging at the time, and found them perfectly compatible. In fact, they used language from both traditions and weaved from one to the other more or less seamlessly. So that's pretty much my sort of short answer. Well, my longish short answer to that question.
Yeah, no, that's a perfect starting point. Well, you talk in your paper about how we really only have three options for dealing with the poor. Lay those out for us.
Well, one thing you can do is just shoot everybody who's poor, right? That's okay. Or I have to update my paper because euthanasia has now become very popular. Or make euthanasia easier and encourage it for the sick and the mentally ill and the impoverished and the depressed and so on. So let's get rid of all these people, okay? And that'll sort your problem out. Well, it won't, of course. Okay. So that's just my sort of radical thing. The other is to accept as a kind of given that there is an element in our society which is to some extent socially irredeemable, to gather them all together and put them on a reservation somewhere where we don't have to look at them. Just send them out there, give them enough money to live on and amuse themselves, like the proletariat in Rome, and basically tell them you're useless, you're a waste of space, we don't care about you, we don't want to hear from you until it's election time, in which case we expect you to go and vote for us so that we continue to give you this money, okay? That's the second option. Or we can make them unpoor. And I often think it's rather strange. Can you imagine if, for example, if you broke your leg And, so they put it in a cast and you hobble around, with a crutch for a while. And then you say, when can I expect to take the cast off and get rid of the crutch? And the doctor says, oh, well, I mean, hey, let's not go too far. I expect you to I expect you to walk around like this for the rest of your life. Okay. No, that's nonsense. And I mean, Catholic social teaching has this idea that we should have a preferential option for the poor. And I say, yeah. And you know what the best way is to give effect to that? Make them unpoor. Okay. As for example, the economic developments of the last 200 years have lifted the mass of human beings, a significantly larger, proportionately greater mass of human beings, out of poverty, which in fact has been the normal condition of almost every human being for almost all of history. It's quite extraordinary. There are still a very large number of people living in very poor circumstances. I fully realize that I'm not making light of that. But proportionately, it's very small compared to what it was. And the reason for that is simply because of the enormous wealth that we have managed to create and distribute in various ways to a hugely expanded population. Nothing like this has ever been seen in the world since before 1800. And so that's how you do it. You either kill everybody, put them on the reservation, or you do your best to make them unpoor.
Yeah, well, remember about a decade ago when I was going through my own political conversion, my journey towards libertarianism. I didn't in 2015 really even know what it was as a philosophy, but I was a bivocational minister, so I had a day job where I worked in this production facility, and then I was in ministry by night. And one of those things that I learned through that experience was how the welfare system did really enable people to continue to live in these very degenerate lifestyles, and there were a lot of problems that I saw with it, but I couldn't shake the idea that there needed to be some sort of social safety net. Like that was for me. And it's kind of like you were saying at the beginning, there are a lot of people that have this emotional aversion to libertarianism because of what might happen to the poor if we eliminated those government programs. Now, over time, I've been completely dissuaded by that. But obviously, when we're talking about welfare, we are talking about taxpayer funded programs that are designed to target particular groups of people that the government has identified as being at risk or in need. And you argue in your paper that there are two kinds of welfare that governments provide, either corporate welfare or social welfare. And it might be helpful to explain both of those and what each of those are designed to do.
Right. So first of all, in both cases, wealth is taken by force or by the threat of force from those who work and is given to others. Now, when people tend to talk about welfare, they have in mind primarily and sometimes only social welfare. Yeah. But they forget, by the way, that the state has friends. Okay, they have pals. Okay, and enormous amounts of money go to businesses that are too big to fail, to banks that can't be allowed to fail, to bailouts in various ways, to effective monopolies, for example, as in agriculture and say the sugar industry in the United States. This is an enormous amount of money, which is taken from your average taxpayer who, has got a normal job, comes home and so on, pays and has this money taken out of his paycheck, and it's given to these people. And as a libertarian, I fully object to this. This normally comes as a huge surprise because people tend to think if you're a libertarian, you're pro big business. And I go, actually, you can pretty much take it as a guide that if the word big can be prefaced to anything, I'm against it.
Yeah.
Okay. Big business, okay, big unions, big anything generally is something that's on the take from the taxpayer. That's a problem. And the basic reason for that is that it's a form of theft. You're having your money taken from you and given to somebody else who can probably afford it, who can afford to take any particular loss that they have, a lot more than you can. When it comes to social welfare, on the other hand, we've got a number of problems. I remember, this must be about maybe 10 years ago. I used to do a lot of media work, and before they discovered what I was. And I went on this radio program, and it was a sort of review of the day, and we didn't know what was happening, and they kind of, they took out the papers of the day, they read through them, and somebody read a headline, and it said something like, 1/4 of children in Ireland are living in poverty. And I said, no, they're not. And everybody looked at me and they said, yes, but the report says this. And I said, I don't care what the report says. I can tell you from just walking around that 1 in 4 children in Ireland are not deprived of food, deprived of drink, have no home, have no shelter, and have no clothes, and are sleeping tonight rough. That's just false. And they go, yes, but the figure is, and I say, yeah, but what you're doing there is you're stipulating some arbitrary amount, okay, and then determining that everybody below that is living in poverty. I would have to tell you that in the era when I grew up, 99% of people living in Ireland would have been living in poverty. Okay, I would have said I grew up poor, except that we didn't know we were poor, so we didn't complain about it. Okay? So the question is, so one of the funny things about it, the USA must be one of the few countries in the world where poor people are actually fat.
Yeah,
it's quite extraordinary.
It's wild, okay? Man, it is.
And when you think about it, okay, I mean, poverty throughout history has been associated with emaciation and people's bones sticking out and so on, but not with, if you like, having a colour television and a car, enough to eat and drink and so on. That's a very strange kind of technical poverty. But all that said, even if you rule all of that out, there will still be people who, for one reason or another, sometimes it's self-inflicted, very often it is because they have acquired an addiction to drink or drugs or whatever it might be. Sometimes it's just sheer fecklessness. They just don't care and they drift into these situations. I find it really sad as I walk around when I look at somebody begging on the side of the street and I think, you were some mother's son.
Yeah.
So we have this, right? So you think, well, so the argument will be, look, for these people, okay, we definitely need a safety net because without that, they're just going to die in the street. And the answer is, well, yes, if social welfare is the only way in which that kind of help could be provided, but it's not. And in fact, historically, and this is one of the great memory holes that I discovered myself. I have to confess, by the way, I didn't know about this until, say in the last 10 years. And when I discovered this, I was absolutely shocked. I'd never heard about this. That what we now think of as the benefits of social welfare, housing, medicine, medical care, paying people during the periods when they can't work and so on and so forth, that all that had been provided by people themselves, for a significant period of time, and not in groups of 10 or 20, but in hundreds of thousands. Okay, and indeed, in some cases, not only providing for those who were prepared to make a subscription in times when they were relatively well off, but even for people who had no connection to the particular associations. I found that actually startling. And indeed, I discovered that when in the United Kingdom, when the National Insurance Act came in 1911, which covered 12 million people, 8 million of those people, I'm quoting from memory now, so my figures may not be entirely accurate, but they're reasonably accurate. 8 million of those people were already covered by the friendly associations, which have different names, but that's, that'll do us as a term of art. Friendly associations already. And this continued even up to and through the Second World War, so that after the Second World War, when in the UK they were introducing what was effectively the welfare state, the initial proposal was to incorporate these existing private societies into the welfare thing, and it was rejected. And so, of course, what we got was the phenomenon of crowding out, because if you get something, it's perfectly rational. If you get something for nothing, okay, and so if I offer you something for nothing and somebody else offers it to you for a cost, you're going to take it for nothing. Okay?
Yeah.
Of course, it's not really for nothing, okay, because somebody else is paying the bill, but that's how it worked, and that's what happened, and it's quite extraordinary. It worked once, and there's absolutely no reason why it wouldn't work again. And by the way, the benefits are not only that the wealth of those who don't want to subscribe to it isn't taken from them involuntarily, so we don't have a case of mass theft. Charity also, by the way, exists together with this. But what happens is that people, first of all, take responsibility for their own welfare at minimal cost. You can take out insurance against catastrophic illness or accident, just as you do, for example, in your car. If you have a car, you can have minimal insurance. Okay, it doesn't cover your oil and gas. It doesn't cover any of the repairs and so on. But if you're in a pileup and you kill 3 or 4 people, God forbid, okay, then you're not going to end up like 25 million in debt.
Right.
All of that can be done. You're covered for when you're out of work. You're covered for your medical care. Many of these associations, in fact, provided extraordinary things. They hired their own doctors. They had their own hospitals. It was incredible. They helped you find the job. They gave you money to go in search of a job. It was quite extraordinary that this and so on. And all of this, but I'm not making this up. And if people look up my paper, I've included a few references there so they can check it out. It's quite extraordinary, and it's absolutely amazing that when I used to talk to my students about this, they really didn't believe me. They thought it's either libertarianism, okay, with no social welfare, and then everybody dies.
Right.
Or we have to have a safety net. Okay, and I go, no, that's not quite how it works. And the other thing, of course, was that these societies were administered by the people themselves who took responsibility for it. These people knew who they were dealing with. They knew who was sick, who was disabled. They knew who was genuinely, through no fault of their own, out of work, and those who were malingering. They were able to tell. No state system has the kind of information that these local associations could possibly have. And it also meant, by the way, that whatever you received not from a kind of Lady Bountiful, from the on high to low, as a form of charity, which in a sense is always problematic. To be on the receiving end, it's good to get the stuff, but really to have somebody hand it to you, it doesn't do much for your I don't know what you describe it, for your self-respect.
Yeah.
And so it empowers people, both those who administered it and those who received the benefits were receiving them not as a gift, not as charity, but as a right, as something they had actually paid for. Now, when you have all of these things in place, you will still have poor. There is no perfect system. In other words, it's not a question of my system, our perfection. And if we can't have perfection, then we have to go with social welfare. No, there will always be poor. But of course, in the libertarian world, which I keep saying to people when I'm talking about this, is not just your world minus a few things. It's a conceptually different. It's a world organized in a conceptually different way, with respect for people's freedom and responsibility. And so there will be very, very much fewer poor people, right? Who then can be the recipient, if necessary, of charity. There will be very many more people who will have very much more money than they otherwise would have, which they can dispose of in different ways. And people say, oh, well, and how do we know it would work? And the answer is, well, I don't know. But right now, people already paying 40 to 45% of their income in tax also give to charity. Okay, if I didn't have to give that money to charity, of course, I could just build a swimming pool, or I could take 4 holidays a year, or, amazingly, I might actually give more to the poor. So there will be fewer poor people and more wealth available for charity, so that I would think that when you compare the view that the position we have with institutionalized state-funded welfare programs and the libertarian model, the libertarian model wins out hands down.
Yeah, man, that's such a great point. You did a great job of covering these mutual aid societies. And I kind of want to double back and talk about this a little bit. I remember I first encountered this in the work of Thomas Sowell. And I think it was about 5 years ago, I started reading some of his literature, and I realized it was exactly like you said. Okay, so before the implementation of the welfare state, and I think Thomas Sowell's line is that no one was dying in the streets. And then he explained how these mutual aid societies worked. And like you were saying before, the extent to which nearly everybody was covered by them. And it's just that completely changed my worldview on welfare. And I stopped believing in that system altogether. I guess my question to you as a follow-up is this was successful. And like you said, the moral hazards that come with welfare aren't present in these mutual aid societies, and the kind of the dignity and the sense of community and all of the things that are built into that. It's obviously so efficient. Why in the world would politicians want to erode a system like that was already working?
Well, that's a good question. And there's a good answer, which is that, let me interrupt myself. there's an old joke that if you ask a man, how many times do you think about the Roman Empire? Many will say, every day. Okay. I don't think about it quite every day, but it is significant. It's and so on. And one of the things, of course, that led to the switch from the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire was the emergence of the Roman proletariat. And the Roman proletariat were largely dispossessed farmers and so on, who came to the city and were recipients of the free food and the entertainment. Okay, and of course they were expected to be clients of those who were aspiring to the big positions, for example, consul or whatever it might be, and they were expected to vote. So if you are in a position to hand out goodies to people, right, then you expect quid pro quo. You expect them to vote for you, of course, and that's what happens. So you develop clients. We have a clientelistic system where those, as somebody once said, if you rob Peter to pay Paul, okay, you can count on Paul's unswerving support. Okay, and that's pretty much it. We've developed a latter-day proletarian system where those in receipt of social welfare are expected, and in fact will normally, I don't know what the figures are, but I'm sure if you crunch the numbers, you would discover that almost all of those who are living in that situation are voting for people who are providing those benefits or even greater benefits, promise greater benefits. That's not a surprise. That's why. And the politicians benefit because, of course, you have a guaranteed voting base so that you get elected. That's why.
Yeah. Well, we already see all the inefficiencies of this. And again, I know you know this too because we follow each other on Twitter, but I'm a public school teacher. So I'm working in this environment all the time. And I'm lucky enough to be at a really great school and we have a lot of good families, but we still I think about 50% of our population is at or below the arbitrary poverty line, right? So it's like you were saying before, poverty now is a lot different than the way that it was 50 years ago. But still, we have a lot of people that come from very needy families, but it is kind of the same situation. You see these parents that are just so irresponsible and they don't invest at all in the lives of their kids. They can't hold a job down and they're all recipients of these government benefits. And like you said, most of them have a car, they have a TV, they have a cell phone, they have all of these things. And they just expect that it's going to be given to them as a part of this system. And so there's all these very perverse incentives, but I guess it's hard to see how once you have a welfare system that's as big as ours is in the United States, how we could ever roll this back. So how do we go about convincing, maybe we'd have to start with other libertarians and maybe the minarchists and some conservatives or whatever, but how do we go about convincing people that these mutual aid societies and that way of doing welfare that doesn't rely on the use of force or coercion is superior to the giant entitlement system that we have in the United States?
Well, first of all, you're going to have a you're going to have a real problem persuading anybody who's a beneficiary on the existing system that any other system is going to be as good. They're going to figure it's going to be a bait and switch. Okay, that if they go over, they're going to find themselves with less. Okay, so there's a problem. There is a problem of moral hazard here, and it's very difficult to do it. You could, if you wanted a social revolution, go cold turkey. Wow,
Yeah.
that would be incredible. And the benefit of that, of course, is that it would be immediate. The shock would be enormous. I'm not sure if society would survive, but you would get it done. The other thing is a step down system percentage, 10% per year over 10 years until it's gone. And with the introduction of welfare thing. So with mutual aid societies, so that people can actually start to buy into them. And make a contribution, normally for probably less than what it would cost to eat out per week. That's probably the only way you can do it. I often one of the things that comes up, and I'm sure you've experienced this as a libertarian, is people would say, "Well, in a libertarian world, what would happen?" And my answer very often is, "I have no idea because we're not there." But human beings are ingenious, and for most of our history, we've lived in a libertarian world effectively, and we've managed to survive. We may not flourish and so on, but we would do it. So the question is, I can't say for certain, but I know where I want to go, But I know where we are, and where we are is not where I want to go. So the question is then becomes, how do we get there from here? And it seems to me that there are two strategies that one can employ. One is to get you need to get there as quickly as you can. The second thing is you need to get there with the minimal disruption. Because if you have massive disruption, if you did go to cold turkey, what you would end up is anarchy in the bad sense of the word.
Yeah.
You would have social breakdown and God only knows what. So those two principles, if you like, run at right angles to each other. So, for example, I mean, if you said, well, minimal disruption, so we'll do it over a 30,000 year period. Okay, right? That's going to be kind of slow, right? Or you could say, we'll do it instant. You know, we'll take it in stages, and indeed roll back certain kinds of things. Because if you follow the history of the construction of the modern state, you'll see the way in which it was built up. So my strategy, it's not every libertarian strategy, is to deconstruct and come down in the reverse order. And three broad categories here. One, this would not be particularly relevant to you in the USA, but it is to almost all of the economies in Europe. We have the state directly participating in the economy by effectively operating companies and businesses. In Ireland, they're called semi-state bodies. Okay, so for example, electricity was a semi-state body, the provision of power. The telephone system was a semi-state body. The production of peat for burning was a semi-state body. All of these things were effectively being sort of run by the state. So the first thing you need to do is to get the state out of commercial enterprises. That's the first one. So we have moved very significantly in that direction. I don't think that's a problem you have for the most part. The second thing is, if you look at the budget of our government here, you'll discover that well over 50% of what they take from us in taxes is spent in three areas: health, education, and welfare. Does that sound familiar?
Yeah.
And they never get any smaller. Okay? And no matter how much money you put into your health system, it's never great. Okay? No matter how much money you put into your education system, it's not great. Okay? And the welfare system just keeps getting bigger and so on. So all of those need to disappear. And that's where the mutual aid societies come in. And so you've now taken down two levels. And now the only level that's left is what would have been considered in a liberal philosophy, liberal in the old sense, classical liberal, that the state is responsible for the provision of law, justice, and security. And people will say, well, you need at least one monopoly. There can only be one provider of law, justice, and security. I actually looked again at our figures here, and it turns out that only 4% of government expenditure is spent on justice and security. It's quite striking. I mean, it's amazing. Okay, and of course you see what happens in the UK, for example, where a woman just posted recently. I don't know if you saw it. It was on my feed. She'd just come home having had her baby about 5 days before, and these masked men broke into her home armed with knives and balaclavas and threatened her, forced her to give them the keys of the car, and took all the money she had and went away. She called the police. A policeman arrived 3 hours later and said, oh, well, since no one's been injured, we won't, we were too busy to kind of waste any time on this. And I'm thinking, really? This is how it works?
Right.
I mean, that's really bizarre. And that's to say, I mean, 75% of burglaries or whatever the figure is go unreported, like 89% of shoplifting. It's just, people say crime doesn't pay. And the answer is, well, yes, it does. Particularly here, because we don't have a 3-time loser thing here. So people can have like 69 convictions.
Yeah.
And they come up and they walk out of the court, and even if the police are doing their best, which they don't necessarily always do, but even if they are, they get discouraged because the guys are just laughing at them as they walk out. So we have a real problem here. So how would a libertarian? Why would it be better? Well, the answer is because right now, if you if somebody comes and steals your TV, okay, and you call the cops, and they come 3 days later, which is probably what would happen. They will do the usual thing. They'll ask you for the registration numbers and so on and so forth. And you will say, well, any chance of getting it back? And they will laugh because you're never going to get it back, right? And so what about getting hold of the guy who took it? And they go, well, there's almost no chance of that, right? And even if we did, the chances are he wouldn't be charged. And even if he were charged, and even if he comes to trial, chances are he'll get a suspended sentence. And even if he doesn't get a suspended sentence and spends some time in jail, it's going to cost 80,000 euros a year to keep somebody in jail. And you know who pays for that? You do. And here's the really sad thing: you still don't have a TV. Okay. Now, all right. So suppose we pay a subscription to a protection service, which combines with the protection of our property and our persons an insurance element, so that in, say, my neighborhood where there are 200 houses in my estate, we pay somebody, and one of the things that you get is that if your TV is stolen, your TV is replaced, not with the one that's stolen, but with a comparable model. And your right to take action against the thief and to pursue them is given to the company which has the resources and the time and the interest to do it. And you put a plaque on the front of your house and it says protected by the Acme Insurance and Protection Company, or whatever it might be, right? So any opportunistic burglar or whatever looking at this and seeing it thinks, and the house next door doesn't have one, is thinking, I'm not going into your house.
Right.
Okay. So it's a deterrent. So this would work. And of course, and if they failed to provide you with the requisite level that you contracted for, you would sue them. I'm sure you'd be surprised to know, by the way, that certainly here in Ireland and in the UK, the police have no obligation to protect you. It's quite striking.
Yeah.
It's incredibly expensive, I mean, relatively speaking, but they actually have no obligation to do so. You can't sue them if they don't do it. Right? So even at this level, so we can argue then if people take off the first two levels, the government industries and the health, education and welfare. Okay. Don't start me talking about education, because I will really get, you won't stop me talking for about 40 minutes. Look, it's not hard to teach your children to read. Once they read, basically they're on so on. If they need education, you can train them in whatever way you want to, whether it's mechanics or industry or science, very, very quickly. What do they learn they go to school from 5 to 12. What have they learned by the time they leave at 12? Many of them can't even read and write. What are they doing for 7 years? Well, we know what it is. It's just a very expensive babysitting service. Yeah. That's what it comes down to, by and large, right?
It's true.
You're babysitting. I mean, I'm sorry, this is not.
No, it's true.
And so, this is the case because on those days when school is shut down for whatever reason, it causes chaos because the parents have to make arrangements to look after their own children. Much of secondary education, by the way, is similarly pointless and wasted. It doesn't. What are they doing for 6 or 7 years? And then they go to university, and I don't even know what they're doing there. So by the time they come out, they don't seem to know a whole lot, and it's cost a small fortune. It's quite an extraordinary thing. But anyway, health is the same, and welfare we've talked about. So when you come down then to the final thing about how best to do this, we can have a nice in-house discussion among libertarians about whether we need minarchism or anarchism, and that's a lot of fun. But if somebody were to offer me in the morning, if they said, here's a button, and if you press this, you will go with whatever minimal amount of time is required to avoid chaos, you will arrive at a minarchist state. I would push that button so fast,
right.
I get burns on my finger. I still want to go further, okay, but I would go there really, really fast. That would be such an improvement on where we are now.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I guess I got two more questions for you before I let you go today. One of them has to do with how we convince Christians that these mutual aid societies are superior to government provided welfare. And I know, at least amongst conservative Christians in the United States, a lot of the people that I go to church with are very generous. And I think that they would probably be more naturally interested in having these conversations. Now, when you start talking about things like Social Security, that's when people get a little sensitive and everything, because they love their Social Security programs and all of that. But one of the things that we were kind of talking about earlier today off the show as well is just the episode that actually was released as today that I put out as we were doing this interview is about why libertarianism is superior to progressivism and conservatism. And in reality, it's because progressivism and conservatism both rely on varying degrees of violence against peaceful people in order to see their particular social goals enacted. And libertarianism is a rejection of that. You would think that for Christians that believe that Jesus is the Messiah and that his death on the cross is supposed to be an example for how we treat other people, would be naturally open to coming to the conclusion about certain political systems that aren't based on violence. But it's kind of a hard sell for Christians. So how do we go about having this conversation with Christians that might share our like moral or theological principles, but haven't applied those to their political beliefs?
Well, again, I mean, I wish I had an easy and really persuasive answer for you on this, and I don't. But here's the thing. I mean, when we read Scripture and we read the Gospels and Jesus is talking, I don't see any place where he said, "You all have a moral obligation to give money to the Romans so that they can set up welfare programs." Right?
Not one.
Yeah, maybe I missed something really, really, but I don't remember that anywhere, right? He looks you in the eye, every single person, individual, not a group. He looks you in the eye and says, "You got to take care of your neighbor."
Yeah.
Okay. And um, probably the scariest part of all Scripture is Matthew 25.
Yeah.
And that doesn't scare the hell out of you, literally scare the hell out of you. I don't know what does. Because Jesus there doesn't say, "Did you turn up every Sunday?" I don't remember that being in there. Says, "Did you have kind of all the right beliefs so that, you were your brand of Calvinism or whatever, even Catholicism, whatever, so on." None of that. He says, "Did you feed me? Did you give me to drink? Did you come and visit me in jail?" And there are the usual gormless idiots there going, "We never saw you." Okay. And he says, yeah, dopey. But there were lots of other people out there, and they're all part of me. And when you gave them to eat and to drink, you gave it to me. And when you didn't give it to them, you didn't give it to me. Now, so the point is, you can't do the kind of modern Scrooge thing and say, "Don't we have workhouses? Don't we have social welfare?" That doesn't relieve you from your obligation. But here's the thing. No one has the right to tell you how to satisfy that. That's a matter between you and God and your conscience. Right? And most of us, if we are being honest with ourselves, are probably on the skimpy side.
Yeah.
Right? Now, interesting enough, by the way, and so well, of course, we just had this row with the Vice President Vance and his Ordo Amoris coming out, and that people are getting all head up, and I'm going, "Sorry, where have you people been like for the last, I don't know how many years?" Hang on a second. I don't remember when Jesus when he tells the parable of the Good Samaritan, he doesn't find it necessary to tell his fellow Jews to look after their families. That's a given. Okay, of course you do, right? He doesn't need to tell them to look after fellow Jews. That's a given, right? He just says, there are other people, okay? And abstractly considered, all of those people are in need, and you must do what you can. But then Paul comes around, and there's a passage in 2 Corinthians 8, 11 to 13, where he says, I'm just reading it here because I don't want to misquote it. He says, "Give according to what you have, not to what you don't have." And of course, I don't mean your giving should make life easy for others and hard for yourselves. That's part of Scripture too.
Yeah.
It's all in there, right? So again, it's a question, like many of us, we incline, as it were, to laziness or over energetic, and we need to kind of get a mean in between. So many of us are inclined to be a little bit stingy when it comes to looking after and to giving to charity. I understand that, and so on. We could probably always do more. We could give, as the saying goes, till it hurts. But nonetheless, that's command that's addressed to you. Okay, and you try telling Jesus, okay, on the last days you stand in judgment. Hang on a second, we had this great social welfare system. Yeah, that's going to work.
No, I love it. That is a perfect way to put a bow on our conversation about the mutual aid societies. But I've really enjoyed talking with you today, Jared, and I'm going to have you back on sometime to talk about these issues in more detail. You are a Catholic, and I have I guess a tradition on this show that whenever I have a Catholic on, I love to just ask them what they find to be valuable about their Catholic faith. I was born and raised, I guess it's not born and raised Catholic, but I was born Catholic, and I went to a Catholic church for the first 8 or 9 years of my life. So I have a lot of vivid memories, went through the process of like first communion, confession, and all of that kind of stuff. And I have a deep respect for the Catholic Church. Many of my family members and friends are Catholic. So this isn't an antagonistic question. I'm genuinely curious, what draws you to the Catholic Church, and where do you find spiritual value in your Catholic faith?
Again, you're asking me really hard questions. I wish I had a great answer to this one. Well, first of all, I mean, to come back to where I started, I owe my conversion to Christianity in large part, at least, to my Protestant friends. And therefore, I have a great respect for the believing, convinced, practicing Protestant, whatever tradition that may be. I admire it. I admire their commitment to the foundational value of Scripture, their knowledge of Scripture, the way they practice their faith, and so on. There is no problem there for me. Okay, we can. In fact, the friend I told you about who challenged me, we continued that conversation for the next 30 years and still do when we meet. I mean, we still argue over various things, okay, various points and so on. But it's mutually friendly, and we tell each other we're wrong about this and so on and so forth. In a sense, at one level, of course, it matters, and another level, it doesn't matter, because we are fellow Christians, fellow believers in Christ. Jesus Christ is our Lord and Savior, and so on. But for me, I think he was a little bit annoyed when I came back and became Catholic, and he was sort of thinking, well, why haven't you considered all of the other options? And I don't mean this to sound offensive in any way, but there aren't any other options for me, because, and again, this is obviously contentious, the fullness of revelation is found for me in Catholicism. It's not that I don't find it annoying. I do. It's not that I don't find our bishops weak-willed and less than the kind of people who would probably go to the stake, and so on, and not to mention anything about people on the most senior level. Okay, all of these things are there, but there. I feel like Peter when in John 6, when Jesus turns after he talks about the Eucharist, talks about the eat my flesh and drink my blood, and he says, "Will you leave me too?" And Peter says, "Where else will I go?" And I mean, if I had another realistic option, I'd be there in the morning. Okay, Islam is starting to look good. No, I'm just joking.
Right.
Okay. So yeah. I mean, one of the favorite things about being a Catholic is you can be rude about Catholicism in a way that you can't be when you're not. And there's a very old Catholic joke, was that at the meeting of the Catholic bishops, a shiver ran around the room looking for a spine to run up. And that's pretty much how I feel. So for good and bad, for ill, I mean, the church, I believe, is one and holy, Catholic and apostolic. The person of the church is perfect. The personnel of the church, however, including yours truly and all of the others, are very far from perfect, and that's something we've simply got to live in. But that's it. And even at times when my faith is hanging by a thread, I believe, for example, in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist and all of the sacraments. All of these things maintain my life and keep me going. They're my kind of spiritual food. And occasionally I'm reminded that I am not the greatest thing in the universe. I'm not the only person that matters in the universe. Other people do too. I know it's a shock. I have to live with that, but there we are.
Well, Dr. Gerard Casey, thank you so much for talking with me today. Before I let you go, where can people find your work and follow you?
You're going to have to go online, so you can find my books on Amazon. Um, I think that's the main thing. Other bookstores might have them. They're generally they're not the kind of bestsellers that you're going to find in your local small town bookshop. You may find them in some of the larger bookshops, say in New York or someplace like that. But I think the best thing to do is to go online and look around, and you'll find them there.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Don't forget Twitter.
Sorry.
Okay. Give my so my Twitter is. Geez, do I remember? I can't.
It's something dark, Casey. I'll put it in the show notes.
Put it in the show. All right, yeah. And by the way, if you want to know why dark isn't there, people have said, "Oh, this is very suspicious." Why is that? Because I resisted going on Twitter for many years, and eventually a friend convinced me. And so my first post, my first tweet was, "I have gone over to the dark side."
No. I love it. I love it. Well, I'll put links to all that stuff in the show notes. Thanks again so much for coming on the show today.
All right, Alex. Lovely to talk to you. God bless.